Good afternoon. And while everybody's beginning their lunch, what I'd like to do, first off, I'm the Reverend Stephen Wander Adams, and I work full-time with Hospice of the Western Reserve, and then help out at congregations as needed. And I've been in the presbytery for 32 years now, came here from seminary, and came here to be the Interim Associate Pastor at Old Stone. So the rest of the bio's been published, I know. But I had a long commute today. I'm 7/10 of a mile up on Guilford. So it was delightful to roll out of bed, get everything ready, and go, oh, I can get there on time. So I want to welcome everyone. Thank you so much for taking this time. And while you're eating, I'd like to begin by singing Amazing Grace. And I'm going to include verses that go back to 1779. So they're ones we don't typically hear. But what I'd like you to do is receive this as a meditation for preparing us to have a conversation today. And allow the words to meet you in a new way. Because it's a hymn that we tend to automatically, you hear it, you know it's there, and sometimes we tune out things that are automatic. And yet so much of our theology and so much of the grounding in our just general cultural beliefs come from our hymns. So I invite you to listen to this in a new way and see how you feel it is touching you about our topic today.
Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now am found, was blind, but now I see. 'Twas grace that taught my heart to fear, and grace my fears relieve. How precious did that grace appear, the hour I first believed. Through many dangerous toils and snares, I have already come. 'Tis grace hath brought me safe thus far, and grace will lead me home. The Lord has promised good to me. God's word, my hope secures. God will my shield and portion be, as long as life endures. Yea, when this flesh and and heart shall fail, and mortal life shall cease. I shall possess within the veil a life of joy and peace. The earth shall soon dissolve like snow, the sun forbear to shine, but God who called me here below will be forever mine. When we've been there 10,000 years, bright shining as the sun, we've no less days to sing God's praise than when we first begun. Amen.
When we think about living well through end of life, and I want to acknowledge right from the start, theologically for me and my experience through hospice and being present on the journey of so many people through the dying process. Personally, end of life is an oxymoron because our soul is eternal and our soul never experiences death, just merely laying down this body when it has served us well and no longer able to serve us. And so we have life before we are embodied within our mother's womb. We have life throughout our journey in this physical form, and we immediately enter into God's realm. So it is a continuum of life. And for me, it's important to hold that up as we talk about these issues, because so often our culture has seduced us to believe that death has the final word, that the death of the body is, it's something that we always fear, it's something that we always dread. And so many of us have difficulty grieving after a loved one dies because we stay stuck with that physical form. But the reality is, for our loved one, and for us when that time comes, we merely step out of this body and continue living. So it's so important that we keep that image in our mind. Then this time of life is not so dreadful, but it's one more life passage, one more step in our journey. And it changes how we embrace that. So then we really can live well and focus on the quality of our life through a decline time, and not all this angst and internal energy avoiding even talking about it. Because when you think about it, typically in our culture, you don't talk about your funeral plans. You don't talk about end-of-life planning. So if you're comfortable raising your hand, I'd like to know how many here have their will up to date? Okay. And I say up to date because you could do it one day and 10 years later you can go, oh, wouldn't be as accurate today. So how many here have a durable power of attorney for their health care? Okay, excellent. How many here have a power of attorney for their finances? Excellent. Okay. How many here have their funeral plans made? Okay. How many here that have funeral plans made have prepaid them? Okay. So did you see where we diverged? We diverged very quickly at funeral planning. And we diverged even quicker on prepaid on funeral planning. Why is that? And that's part of why we're here today. I have the materials there you can take home, you can peruse. I encourage you to talk to your family, whether that is blood family or extended family that is who you surround yourself with, and to talk about what are your wishes. And I also encourage you to start thinking, if I'm attending my own funeral, which you will, what do I want that to look like? Okay? And what really represents me, and how can I in turn comfort those that don't get to go on this part of the journey with me yet? Okay? Because it is so important. And again, I blame that on our culture, because it is just not a topic we normally talk about. And yet, the reason that I've brought in some elements of the celebrations of the Day of the Dead, Dia de Muertos, and I created an altar that would be like a Day of the Dead altar, and I've included my family that have gone before me, and yet I'm very much connected with, and have never been separated from. And for the camera and everything, I'm going to take this time just to introduce you to my family that spiritually are very much here. And when we talk about the communion of saints, when we break bread together as here, or break bread in communion, we invoke the presence of all those that have gone before us to celebrate that meal with us. And in all honesty, when I'm breaking bread at breakfast or lunch or dinner, I make it a conscious effort that that is Eucharist. And that is, I'm in the company of my dad, my brother, my sister, my aunts and uncles. And we're sharing that meal. But culturally, we don't tend to perceive it that way. So you can come up and look later, but this will at least bring them closer, at least a little bigger. This is my mom's mom and dad, the Clarks. And I got to know them through the beginning of my life up until my teens. This is my dad. And I'll talk a little bit why I chose to have his high school picture a little later. But my dad died just months after I was ordained and moved to Cleveland. So he's been gone for 32 years. This is my dad's parents, and they were both deceased when I was born. Okay. So that's my dad's parents. And then down here, you can show my sister. That's my sister Nancy. And she died in 2010 of breast cancer. And this is my brother, Walter. And he died in 2005. And then here, these are my uncles. The gentleman in the bed is my Uncle Ralph. That was my dad's youngest brother. And he really was a father figure for me. And As you know from the bio, I'm married to a man, and we've been married legally only 10 years, but together 28 years. And my uncle is my role model. My uncle and the gentleman beside him, my uncle, I saw Uncle Ralph's in the bed, Uncle Walter sitting holding his hand. They were together 56 years when my Uncle Ralph died. And my Uncle Ralph died at the age of 85. And then Uncle Walter died at the age of 92, a number of years later. And then on the far corner, I can't leave out my beloved Butterball. Butterball is 12 and a half and just died this summer. So we're still grieving her leaving us physically. And the reason I included Butterball is when I tell a few stories, hospice stories today, pets are included. So it's so important that when we grieve our pets who've become very much a part of our family, including them in our image of those that have gone before us and are spiritually still connected to us. So we'll go from there. And if you have questions, or thoughts in the midst of my talking, please raise your hand and interject. As you know, as a pastor, I can talk for an hour and a half, no problem. So if you're wanting to ask a question as we go, please do.
I want to say that as part of my answer, I agree with the I previously used my pet.
And that's actually, I'm glad that you shared that, because we are able to create ways of caring for our loved one pets as well, if we predecease them. And I've actually had hospice patients that have had their pets cremated, and then they were buried with them when they died as well. The other cultures, and the reason that I rooted us, we recently had Day of the Dead celebration throughout the world, and we recently had All Souls Day. So Day of the Dead celebrations are very different than traditionally how we celebrate All Souls. And All Souls tends to be, and I've not been here for All Souls, but All Souls tends to be more of a litany of the names of those that have gone before us, acknowledging them and moving on. And it's typically not seen as an intergenerational experience. Does that ring true? But the Day of the Dead celebrations, from the time children are infant, they are included in the Day of the Dead celebrations. And they literally have meals around those celebrations. And they tell the stories. If we were literally having our Day of the Dead meal and we were at the altar of the family, I would be telling stories so you get to better know my dad's parents, the way I learned about them since they were gone. My dad, my mom's parents, and my siblings, and my uncles, and my dog. And we would take turns telling stories about them. And this is done every year. And yet, so often in our families, we don't take the time to really introduce the children to their elders that have gone before us. And how vital it is, if you're a little kid, you never met great grandma, but you know great grandma by the time you're an adult. And great grandma is much a part of the family as if you had physically met them. And the reason that the photographs are used on the altar is so that, again, you tell the stories with the image before you, and you're invoking their presence by placing them on the altar. You're remembering them. And it's so important that we use the word remember. Because if you think about when we think about that break in physical line, you know, when our loved one dies, how does that feel inside? Feels like part of us is broken, doesn't it? Feels like whenever a loved one dies, it feels like a part of us is broken as we're grieving. And so if you think about the word remember, and then you turn it into a hyphenated word, remember, what's the opposite of that word?
Dismember.
Thank you. It's dismember. So in grief, or in thinking about the death of ourselves or someone else, part of us feels dismembered. And that's why we tell the stories. Because a part of healing and a part of acknowledging the spiritual reality that we live in is remembering, literally. And as we tell the stories, our heart begins to get knit back together again. And we begin to embrace the joy and the laughter again, and not just the tears or the sorrow. And when we give ourselves permission to start letting this be a part of our daily life, instead of what we're avoiding, we live better lives. We live better qualities of life. And our families are healthier for it, because a child that grows up sharing these meals on the graves, because in many of the cultures, they literally take the tablecloth, throw it over the grave, and they sit around that grave and they tell the stories there. And they break bread there. And so those kids aren't afraid of death. If you want to watch a wonderful Disney Pixar movie, Coco.
Oh, no, that's the my child was so satisfied. I thought what a wonderful way to celebrate all of those people who came for us.
Yes.
Also, they introduced me to the Day of the Dead.
Yes. So I encourage you, if you haven't seen it, give yourself permission to watch it. It's called Coco.
I'm curious, since our culture doesn't celebrate, what cultures around the country, where are they in
Yes.
tune with this more? I'm thinking of Mexico, but,
Yes.
but if you could maybe touch on that a little bit.
Yeah, Mexico is the closest that we are typically exposed to.
Yeah.
So in Mexico, in all the Latin American countries, in Greece, and in the Mediterranean countries, they have similar celebrations. And even in Greece, they don't wait just for the Day of the Dead celebration. They actually go on the anniversary of the death, and they have the meal on the grave on the anniversary, and that's where they tell the stories as well.
I just had a conversation about this with a friend in Hungary. I've never even heard of the Day of the Dead before, but he talked about the fact that in Hungary, it's a national holiday, and everyone goes to the cemetery
Yes.
and takes flowers
Yeah.
to the grave. And then I talked to my sister-in-law who lived in Texas, and she said that in Texas, the Mexicans especially have all-day parties in the cemetery on the Day of the Dead.
Yes.
They really rock it party. And in our culture, we so often don't even live anywhere near our deceased ancestry graves. So it's a little bit difficult here.
It
And
is.
we're obviously missing something.
Very much so. And yet, by virtue of creating something like this, it doesn't matter how far you are from the grave, they're present.
Help Floyd remember the first time at birthday. not the anniversary. It's lucky not, I wonder why that is. I know my daughter said, no, I don't want to do it on the day Daddy died, I want to do it on his birthday, so they tell stories that my grandchildren really do remember. And any holiday like Thanksgiving or Christmas, we have a special candle on the table for the grandfathers that are going on. But the other thing that we were talking earlier about, not to delineate, your soul was there before you were born and goes on. It's always bothered me at a funeral and memorial service when they say, and now God, please accept them. And no, you already have. Why don't you say, thank you for accepting them
Yes.
already? We act like, you know, we are too gone by. Okay, now we're going to get into the story. When I die, like they're actually saying that we know what's going on. 2 weeks later, she's there.
Amen.
What she said on the mic,
Sure.
so that for the people at home watching
Oh,
later.
there's nobody at home.
I know. but
Oh,
when-
later.
because of the-
Later.
Yeah. They just kind of.
Okay, my family has the tradition of remembering those saints who've gone before on their birthdays. We actually get cupcakes and then we tell stories, and now my grandchildren can even tell stories. And then also, I've always been bothered by the fact that at funeral or memorial service or celebration of life, we say, oh, now thank you, God, that they've entered into your presence. Well, they've already entered into your presence, so when I die, don't act like after 2 weeks I'm entering into God's presence. I want you to say thank you that she has already.
And that is, and I want to ground this in scripture with what you just said. Because when we talk about Jesus on the cross, this very day you will be with me in paradise. Present with the Lord. Amen. And one of the things that I love about this very day, you will be with me, is that word with, he could have chosen any distance word that still would have fit in that sentence. But he chose the one that means literally to step into the next room. Literally to just step in to the next room. Not some great distance. We tend to think of physical life and heaven like this, but it's like this. It's interwoven. And I'll read from 2 Corinthians, and this is a passage that many of you may know, but a lot of times isn't included in the lectionary, so it's not often heard. Listen to these words and see what you glean from them. So we do not lose heart, even though our outer nature is wasting away. Our inner nature is being renewed day by day. For this slight momentary affliction is preparing us for an eternal weight of glory beyond all measure. Because we look not at what can be seen, but what cannot be seen. For what can be seen is temporary, but what cannot be seen is eternal. For we know that if the earthly tent, this body that we live in, is destroyed, we have a building from God, a house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. For in this tent, our very body, we groan under our burden, because we wish not to be unclothed, but to be further clothed, so that what is mortal may be swallowed up by life. God, who has prepared us for this very thing, has given us the Spirit as a guarantee. So we are always confident, even though we know that while we are at home in the body, we are away from the Lord. For we walk by faith, not by sight. Yes, we do have confidence, and we would rather be away from the body and at home with the Lord. So whether we are at home or away, we make it our aim to please God. Where is our perfect image of the physical and the soul within the physical. And that even when our body is declining in health, our soul is getting all the more awakened and ready to lay this body down and step forward immediately into God's realm. That's where I'd like to start sharing a few stories.
Can you give us the verse in 2
Yes,
Corinthians?
yes. That's taken from 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 16, going on to chapter 5, verse 9. Okay. And part of why I'm not focusing as much on the pragmatic things at the moment is I do want us to embody this whole sense of how our faith can really strengthen our ability to live well through the end of the life of this body. And it helps us make the decisions that we need to make for this body. Because this body is temporary and we are eternal. And youth is temporary. Even though our culture would like to make you think that you can somehow keep being youthful in the sense of, okay, I'm going to make sure everything stays intact to the very moment that my body stops. And so that's why so many of us avoid having the conversations about what things do we want if our body suffers severe illness or if our heart stops. Like, we often think, well, I want everything done till that last moment. And yet, everything done puts us into very dangerous territory, depending on what our physical health was prior to an event. Everything done is typically for somebody that's in a car accident and has good health prior to that car accident, or suffers a heart attack at the age of 30, and they do CPR and it is able to revive that person. But I'll be honest, I'll maybe talk about this a little, but I had CPR that had to be done when I was 5, because I had an anaphylactic shock, respiratory arrest, cardiac arrest, and then they had to do CPR to bring me back. So I have the physical scars of what that did to my body at a 5-year-old. My ribs are still healed in a weird way on the one side, because when they do CPR, they crush your ribs. But we don't think about that. We just think that, oh, we watch it on TV, you know, the good doctor does the CPR, the guy's jolly and healthy and walking away the next day. But there's physical consequences for having chest compressions done. It breaks your ribs. And if you're frail, and if you've been dealing with cancer, and your body is depleted, and your heart stops, and they do CPR, not only is your body dealing with the fact that your body is declining from the cancer, but you now break majority of your ribs. And if you do get resuscitated, you live with that pain for what time you have left. And so, but that's why it's so important to have those conversations, because we don't typically get to make that decision for ourselves in that moment unless we have this paperwork done, and unless we've had those conversations with the people that we're empowering with those paperwork. I can't tell you how many people in hospice get to the last days and weeks of their life, and they go, oh yeah, I have a durable power of attorney. You know, my cousin or my niece or my daughter are gonna make that decision if I can't. And then we contact the cousin, niece, or daughter and we say, okay, we need you to be making some decisions here. Your loved one's no longer able to. And they're like, what? She wants me to do what? And then they never had the conversation. And how burdensome that is if they don't know what their loved one really wants. And it also, I help people to reframe that by saying, what is your loved one's body telling you makes sense in this moment? In line with the conversations you've had before. Because if I'm the power of attorney, I'm really not making that decision. I am the advocate for that person's decision and what their body's telling us. And when you frame it that way, it's not as burdensome, but it's actually an honor to help care for a loved one when they can't care for themselves. So a couple stories, and then I want to return to that area so that we really are thinking about what are the conversations we haven't had yet, or what haven't I really thought through well. Because there's a fine line. Science is so advanced that there's a fine line that if we say I want everything done, trust me, they will. And they will blur the line from being able to give you a quality of life and prolong your life, and they'll blur into the realm of where they're prolonging your death. And we don't usually use that language, but that we have to be that conscious of our well-being to be honest to say to ourselves, do I want my quality of life prolonged, or am I willing to let my death be prolonged at any cost? So being at the deathbed, how many people have experienced a loved one visioning at end of life? Okay, so you know what I'm talking about. It is a very normal experience that as people are nearing end of life, and it doesn't even mean at that very moment, sometimes it's months before it begins, sometimes it's weeks, days, it depends on that person's journey. But they begin to see where that veil between the physical and the spiritual just kind of becomes misty, and they're able to see loved ones that have gone before us. And that's partly why I gave you my dad at that age and my sister and my brother at their high school age. Because when people see their loved one and experience them in a vision, typically they're youthful again. They're not, they can appear, they can make themselves appear, just like Jesus showed the wounds in his hand and in his side. They weren't part of his heavenly body, but he could manifest it to show that it was there. And so our loved one can show up to us as an infant if a child died in birth or as an infant, or they can show themselves at what is kind of like the peak age in your late 20s. And so a lot of the times what you're seeing is your loved one in their prime, whatever that is. So one woman, and this woman I'll share with you, she was a devout Roman Catholic. She was the matriarch of a huge Italian family. And so here she is, she's had a recurrence after recurrence after recurrence of cancer. She's an elder now, she's a widow, and she had, from the time of diagnosis, she had really helped her children and grandchildren navigate her declining time. She had grounded them in their faith. She had, reminisced with them. And she had said, I don't fear death. I'm ready for that when God's ready for me. And we'll be together again. And yet, all of a sudden, near the end, closer to near the end, she began to be a very different person to them. She was fearful. She didn't want to go to sleep at night. She kept saying, no, I don't want to die. I don't want to go to sleep. I'm afraid I'll go to sleep and not wake up. And they were really kind of freaked out by it because it was like turning a switch and she wasn't the same person that they knew. And so she had come to Hospice House where I was working, and I went in to introduce myself, and I had heard the stories of why she was there, that she was in a lot of physical pain and a lot of emotional pain and spiritual pain. And so I sat down at her bedside, and as I do, I listen more than I talk in that circumstance. And I asked her, tell me about yourself. Tell me about this journey of dealing with cancer and where it brought you to today. And she gave me the former self. She gave me the bright, faith-grounded woman, and not one word that made me think, why would she be afraid? And so she got done telling her story, and it was as the children had said prior to the fear. And I looked at her and I go, your children are telling me that you don't want to go to sleep at night. She goes, I don't. And I went, okay. I said, are you afraid to die? And she goes, well, quite honestly, yes. I'm like, okay. And I said, and that doesn't jive with what you were just telling me. She goes, I know. And I go, why are you afraid? And she goes, and she wouldn't look me in the face. She turned her head and goes, I don't know. And I go, I believe you do know. And I'd really like to help you with that. She goes, I don't know. And so I was praying about it, and immediately I thought about visioning. And I said, okay, when you do go to sleep, are you seeing someone? She shot her head around and looked at me and she goes, how did you know? And I go, well, who are you seeing? And I'm expecting some horrible figure. And she goes, my husband. And I said, your husband? And she goes, yes. And I said, well, pardon me, but most of the time when people are visioning and they tell me that they're seeing their husband, they're glad to see him again. And she goes, I'm not. And she goes, he was a real SOB. He was an alcoholic, he was physically and emotionally abusive, and when he died, I thanked God. And she said, and if anybody deserves to be in hell, it's my husband, and that's why I don't want to see him again. And I said, okay, I want you to think back. Think back about the first night that you woke up and saw him. And she goes, okay. And she goes, well, one night I was sleeping and I sensed somebody at the foot of the bed. And when I opened my eyes, there he was, standing at the foot of my bed. And she said, and I said, don't go any further. I said, what did you feel in that moment? And all of a sudden, that stern look just melted away and a smile came on her face. And she goes, what I felt was absolute love and joy. I felt like the time we fell in love. That's what I felt. And she goes, I was so happy to see him. And I said, well, then when did it change? And she goes, well, after a while, he said he had to go and that he'd be back for me. And I fell back asleep. And when I woke up in the morning, I thought, I saw my husband last night. And then she said, I thought a little bit more. And I said, I saw my husband last night. And then I thought about all the hell he put us through and where he must be. And that's when I got afraid. And I said, thank you. And I said, now I want you to do me a favor. I want you to go to sleep tonight. And if he comes and visits you, you ask him where he is. And you ask him what he's going to do when you die. And so the next day I go into her room. She is sitting up, bright-eyed. She goes, I was waiting for you. And I said, okay, how's your husband? And I go, did he come to see you last night? And she goes, he sure did. And I said, well, how's heaven? And she goes, Stephen. She goes, he's not in hell. And I go, you're kidding. And she goes, no, he is with God. And he was asking me if I can forgive him. And I said, did you? And she goes, wholeheartedly. She goes, because I realized that that's not the man he became. That's the man he always was to be. And she was able to then talk to her children. All of those unspoken wounds that never got talked about within the children and the grandchildren. And what wonderfully happened for that family was the alcoholism that was always the unspoken and always the danger was now on the table, and it was spoken about. And now those children growing up, they were forewarned. They knew, okay, we're predisposed for that. Now we can be careful about our lifestyle. And she gifted that family and re-grounded them back into their faith, trusting that in God we are fully restored when this body is laid down for the last time. And more, as I've worked with patients through the years, again and again, that's the story that repeats itself. And that's why I would also urge you to not just have the end-of-life conversations, have the family story conversations, the ones that you don't talk about, the ones that get swept under the rug, the ones that my lost family didn't speak about, but just was stoic about. Because you can change your own life and the lives of your family. And this is the warning. Because if you don't do the end-of-life planning, and you wait until end of life, somebody else is going to have to make those plans for you. And if you don't do your own forgiving and giving and receiving forgiveness, you'll do it on your deathbed. And if you ever watch, some people, it's a very easy transition for them. Other people, it's fitful. And typically it's fitful because, like that woman, they don't want to give and receive that forgiveness because they've put it off until then. But God welcomes us into God's realm, but we have to do the work. So don't let it, leave it till then. Teach your children, teach your grandchildren how to restore relationships along the way and live well. And that's part of why I find it so important to have this type of a gathering. Because we do want to live well. We want to take care of all the pragmatic things. Because quite frankly, when you get your funeral planned and get it prepaid, it's a bonus because the market cost of when you paid for that funeral, you're locking it in. And you may not need that for 10 or 20 years or 30 years, but you're paying the 10 or 20, 30-year price rather than the current price. It's a win-win. And you also get to enjoy what are the readings going to be? What are the hymns that I want sung? What is the music? Do I want a viewing or not want a viewing? Do I want to be cremated or do I want to be embalmed? I mean, a lot of times people go, oh, I don't want to talk about that, as though it's going to make it happen. My funeral's been planned for a long time. My mom's as well. And quite frankly, my mom tells me it's not easy getting old. And she's 98, so she knows darn well what it means to get old. And that's part of the planning too, because we want to live well within the circumstances and the setting that we want to live our elder years. but we have to plan those. And there's enough research that says, okay, if I don't take care of my hearing, if I don't get hearing aids when I need them, unlike Uncle Walter, who kept saying, I hear fine, but the TV's up so loud that I was getting earaches and headaches. And he finally gave in, got the hearing aids, and he's like, did you hear that? I'm like, yeah. And his life changed. But our hearing is directly related to how our mind stays intact. If we don't take care of our hearing and we don't use hearing aids when we need them, we have a tendency to have dementia that will advance. It's in the literature. So don't be prideful, don't be stubborn. Get your hearing checked and get hearing aids if you need them. That's living well through your end of life. And also, if you don't have a lot of family living right in your general area, think about leaving a private setting and moving into a communal setting. Because again, the literature is there that shows that once people move from a solo living setting into a communal living, their mentation is better, their mood is better, their health is better. They have a greater well-being because of the socialization. Not many of us, like Bruce and I, do not have children. We have he comes from a small family. I have a ton of nieces and nephews. I've been an uncle since I was 3. But none of them live here in Cleveland. I'm the one in Cleveland. And so, and I expect to live the last of my days in Cleveland. Bruce is originally from Shiger and grew up here, and is from a very small Jewish family. You know, so there's nobody around. His mom, thank God, is still with us. She's 96 this year. She just turns 96 actually on Monday. And so we have a 96-year-old mom, and I have a 98-year-old mom, but both of our dads died a long time ago. His dad died at 54. So he's been gone a very long time. But our mothers both had the wisdom, even though they did it with not being happy about it when they did it, they moved into communal settings. And both of their quality of life. We thought we were losing my mother-in-law within 6 months. She had been living alone and in her house and was declining and wasn't doing well, having all kinds of health issues, moved into Wiggins and wouldn't leave her apartment for like 6 weeks or 8 weeks. Then all of a sudden, grudgingly started getting involved in some things. Now we can't keep up with her because she's either at the movie, at the symphony, at the store, at bingo, which she said she'd never play, playing bridge, you know, she's doing all this stuff, and all of a sudden, you know, we're like, Mom, where are you? And she's like, I'm busy. You tell me when you're coming, we'll set it up on the calendar. 96. So, but that transition was needed for her to have a good quality of life, even though she thought she had the best quality of life living by herself. We can't all do that. We can't all afford to pay for 24/7 care if we're bedbound at home, but move to a communal setting, and it's a different reality there. So that's part of what we're talking about today too. We need to be really thinking about thriving each step of the way. And I'll tell you, the patients that I've worked with through all these years at hospice, because I've been doing end-of-life work for 27 years. And all these years, these people, you would think, okay, their body's deteriorating, like the scripture's saying, but their spirit is engaging. And for many of them, they made huge creative movements just in their relationships and in the restoration of relationships. They're still learning, still growing. emotionally, spiritually, even when the body's declining. That is living well through the end of the life of the body. And it's not, it doesn't just happen. You have to embrace that transition. I'm realizing that we're at time. So I want to ask, are there any thoughts or questions before